Welcome to Season 3 of The Unforgiving 60 with your hosts, Ben Pronk and Tim Curtis. As two ex-SAS guys armed with MBAs, Ben and Tim seek out people leading lives less ordinary and talk with them about how they fill their unforgiving minutes and what helps them go, always, a little further.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to The Unforgiving 60. My name is Ben Pronk.
And my name is Tim Curtis.
And this is our opportunity to get our own back. Mm-hmm. We recently featured as guests on the Dad to Me podcast, and we are now turning the microphones at the hosts of that podcast, Jump Daddy and Dr. Tom.
That's right. Their podcast, the Dad to Me podcast, is a series that poses questions that grown children have always wanted to ask their own dads, but have somehow felt that's too awkward or peculiar to ask. And so really on their show, they offer this translation service. Grown-up children give them the questions, and then they interview the fathers and ask those awkward questions so that children can find a little bit about their fathers, and probably the reverse is also true.
Having said all that, they did nothing of the sort in our episode. They just peppered us with a barrage of awkward questions. No, it was awesome. I really enjoyed being on their show, and I'm really looking forward to having them on ours because my understanding is no one's actually done this before. No one's turned the tables on them and asked them a bit about their backstory, what got them so interested in this concept of fatherhood, and what they've learnt from their podcasts.
Yeah, that's right. They're in season 1, and no one has asked what's motivated them to do this quite unique podcast. You've got a professor of Latin and an entertainer. We're going to explore that, the why, and what are they taking from this podcast where they're interviewing fathers and their children and reconnecting them.
Yeah, and we're going to find out what's next for them in terms of their podcast journey as they take Dad to Me from Australia to the world.
Carpe diem. Let's get on with the show.
Gentlemen, welcome back to the Unforgiving 60 podcast. My name is Ben Pronk.
And my name is Tim Curtis.
And we are both fathers, which is a central theme to what we're going to be speaking about today because we are joined by the crew from Dad to Me
podcast. Dr. Tom and Jump Daddy, welcome to the show.
Hello, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Now, we've turned the microphones around because you had a go at us and now we get a go at you. And I love the theme of the Dad to Me podcast. So you claim that you interview the world's hottest fathers, which we know is true.
Because
now that you've interviewed us.
The exception that proves the rule.
Yeah. And for anyone that hasn't checked out the Dad to Me podcast, do that. The boys take questions essentially from children and then act as a translation service for fathers and talk about all ports in between specific to dads. But I want to get onto the on-ramp with discussing how the two of you met. Let's start there.
This is a can of worms. You've already opened it. So we're old friends from school, actually. So we met in high school. In fact, in Latin class, some of us continued to do Latin inadvisedly for about 20 years after. Jump Daddy quit Latin at the right time. We hung out in Latin class, and then we did a kind of series of projects at school together.
I take it this was in between fending off all the ladies. I mean,
they joke, but
Dr. Tom is a master of the modern day world of apps. Let's just put that there and leave it there.
No, we were incredibly nerdy teenagers, and we were spending a lot of time doing Latin, a lot of time doing sort of various comic stunts. there weren't that many romantic distractions at that point.
It was also a selective boys' school.
Yeah, so, enough said.
Any type of coupling was way down the list of priorities compared to next Tuesday's maths exam, which was central in terms of our conversational gambits during recess. But yeah, and then after high school, Tom and I, we were founding co-presidents of HandSoc, Sydney University's one and still only handball-focused society. And when I say handball, not European handball. No, that game, aka Foursquare, that most kids give up immediately after they graduate from primary school. But we managed to use that as a vehicle to get onto SRC of Sydney Uni. So
Students Representative Council.
Exactly, and so we're in the middle of like genuine, student politicians, some who are now literally in state and federal parliament. We were there fighting tooth and nail for greater awareness, public education campaigns about handball on university campus. And then proceeded...
I was going to ask, were you pushing for its inclusion at sort of university games? Was it this kind of...
Yeah, what we did with handball was actually we treated it as a big sort of metaphor for life and politics. So we sort of extracted these lessons from it.
Sure we did.
No, we basically it was half joke, half serious. Like everything Jump Daddy and I do. It was it did sort of have some of a serious edge. But mainly we just wanted to try and intervene in what is quite a sort of self-important world of student politics, because it's, on campus at that time and at all times, basically, you do just have the Labor Liberal column of future functionaries that are just in training. And it was nice to kind of get in there and disrupt stuff a little bit. Maybe I'm making it sound really kind of a big important intervention, but yeah.
Handball was just the vector for disruption.
Exactly.
Before we even knew what that phrase disruption, we were well ahead of our time. If only we'd monetized it somehow, I'm sure there would have been a way to turn those.
Look, we try to monetize everything, but nothing seems to work out.
Before we leave handball, have you stayed current? My kids are playing it, and I grew up in Queensland, and it was old school rules. They've got all these sorts of variations on sort of rolls and grabs and double hands and all these sort of new rules.
We would be fascinated to, when we set up the competing handball podcast, they're going to be some of our first guests.
Yeah. I'm an absolute purist, though. I prefer, you miss a point, you're out. Grabs doesn't exist, you're out.
Getting
lines doesn't exist, you're out. Just keep it really simple. Keep the turnover quick, and you'll always have a great time.
Old school Queensland rules.
Do you have the Darwinian approach to handball? Is there a hierarchy of squares, that you make your way up to be the king?
Exactly, yeah. Dunce, Jack, Queen, King, in a classic four-square environment. But we introduced, we're getting quite deep in the handball. I'll give you one example of a rule that we introduced. We had a rule called Karl Marx. So if either the Jack or the Dunce, i.e. the working class proletariat or the petty bourgeoisie, they call that, then they're in an alliance against the Queen and the King. The high
you can have a revolution.
Exactly. So you can actually, as a twosome, you can get promoted to the top two spots. That was one of the many, twists that we
I'll tell you what, only at Sydney University would you get the Karl Marx clause on the handball court.
Communist handball.
Now I've seen everything.
Can we leave handball?
Yes.
Okay, so off the handball court and then into your respective professional lives. Jump Daddy, what are you up to at the moment?
Well, currently I am working on behalf of a major nation within the Commonwealth of Nations that will go unnamed for the moment because of various contractual intricacies. But basically, I'm doing propaganda on their behalf. I wish I was joking about that, but it could well be that one of your children comes back from school one of these days, all of a sudden very much infatuated with a large North American country in which English and French are the two official languages, I can say no more.
And
Mexico.
how are you delivering propaganda? What are you doing inside?
Well, basically in my other life, I work in schools as a sort of a comedian come entertainer. So delivering shows and workshops with a comic edge, but often on some pretty dry, fundamentally dry topics like financial literacy, or why the country that they call the Great White North is a wonderful place to be.
And do I remember correctly that you have been involved in some professional sporting competitions to draw awareness to those competitions?
Yes, absolutely. So I was the entertainer that accompanied the Queen's baton ahead of the 2018 Gold Coast Games. So that is a sentence that could be interpreted in myriad.
yes, exactly.
But look, I'll give you my version of it. For those of you who don't know, the Commonwealth Games, which, those of us on this podcast all grew up with, but increasingly kids these days just have no idea what it is. So very simply, it's kind of a version of the Olympics, but for countries which were once part or connected to the British Empire, or not in the case of Mozambique and Rwanda, who just decided to join this thing called the Commonwealth, because why not?
Opt in.
It sounds good, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It was in the Gold Coast in 2018, and like the Olympics, they have something akin to the Olympic torch, which gets taken around the world and then tours around the host country. But it is the Commonwealth, so it's kind of a cut-priced version of it. So there's no flame. It is a stick. It's a baton. And it goes from town to town before descending upon the host city, which is in that case the Gold Coast. But the number of times the marketing manager would be quietly going apoplectic, the Commonwealth Games marketing manager would be quietly going apoplectic as a local politician or a federal senator. Let's welcome the Commonwealth Games flame into Adelaide. And then there's just a definitely not ignited stick down the road.
Dude with a big lighter next to the stick.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And how were you presented inside this? Were you in costume, in character?
Yes. I was in head-to-toe spandex. Initially, I didn't have the sensible accoutrement of a pair of shorts over the spandex, and I simply wore a cricketer's cup. So you definitely did notice when the VIPs, like, the head of the Commonwealth Games, Peter Beattie, had to come up and shake my hand. Hey, Peter, my eyes, my face, my person, not down there.
I'm up here. I'm up here, Peter.
So I would kind of introduce the event and, cap off the event and sort of be an MC, be an entertainer. Again, entertaining, but also really educating people about what on earth was happening today in the lead up of the games, because this big circus would roll into town for one day and one day only. A lot of people would turn up, and a lot of people have absolutely no idea what was going on. And that probably became doubly so when they saw what I was wearing.
Yeah, I love this idea of a dead tradition though that requires an on-site spandex commentator to explain what the hell is going on.
That's right.
So the spandex sounds like it was your idea. I see nothing in what you've described that'd require you to wear spandex.
Well, I can tell you, if listeners are having trouble picturing it, I actually got a costume maker who specializes in creating dance leotards for your suburban dancers, Stedfords, to replicate Kathy Freeman's Sydney 2000 head-to-toe spacesuit. So that might give you a little bit of a sense. And indeed, for a spacesuit that is cut for a petite young woman on an increasingly middle-aged man, there are definitely some difficulties to be surmounted every time I pull on the enclosure, so to speak.
And Dr. Tom, you didn't leave Latin at high school. What have you gone on to do?
Exactly. So, over here, Jump Daddy is getting into all sorts of spandex situations. But yeah, I actually continued doing the same thing. So I did a whole lot more Latin and Greek at university, studied that as an undergraduate in Sydney. And then after that, I decided, look, if I want to keep doing this, if I want to keep doing what I'm doing, Australia is not really the place for it. You can imagine that Latin is not top priority at your average Australian university.
So you went to a country that speaks Latin?
I went to a country that speaks Latin, exactly. The Vatican for me. Yeah, the Vatican
Well,
and only the Vatican.
you talked about the dead culture with relation to the stick. Wikipedia describes Latin as
No, don't
quote,
do this. Don't
a
say
dead
it.
language, unquote. Is that like a dagger to the professor's heart?
I actually have quite strong views about this, and they may not be the views you expect.
Here we go.
I'm happy with Latin being a dead language. In fact, I think that this is precisely the potential of studying it, because you can never get to a level of fluency that you can when you're speaking a modern European language or in any other modern language. It's never it makes, and when you're speaking those languages, language becomes a bit sort of transparent. You just sort of like get it immediately, right? Whereas with Latin, because it's dead, your understanding is a bit clunky. When you're reading it, you sort of pore over every word. It almost forces you to slow down and really kind of absorb and study the literature. And so that's, I think it should remain dead, and I'm happy to say that I study a dead language.
I'm going to test you out. I did Latin until year 12, and in all seriousness find it incredibly useful in terms of the derivation of modern English words, and I love seeing the crossover into the little bit of French and Spanish that I've done. But we used to call our teacher, and this is very sort of pig Latin, ubi lupus. Can you sort of pick together ubi? Am I correct in saying that's where?
Yeah, where wolf.
And werewolf. And
Werewolf.
this dude...
I say...
Do you see what we did there? But this dude had a very full beard that just didn't seem to stop and sort of went all over his face. So we made up this ubi lupus.
Yeah,
phrase.
very good.
Yeah.
Ubi lupus. Yeah, werewolf. I definitely see what you've done there, and I hope that I can inspire such a nickname in my own students.
So, guys, Dad to Me podcast, you're in your first season. You've interviewed celloists, screenwriters, cancer researchers, architects, and the Colonel. What are you learning from your podcast? What are the guests giving back to you as takeaways?
Ooh, yeah, well, this is a big question. I mean, I think we're learning broad stuff about people's relationships with their fathers, obviously, and we're learning kind of, we're learning some sort of typical questions, I guess, that people are asking. So that the format of the podcast, just very briefly, is that that we receive questions from these from children, grown children, that they've always wanted to ask their dad. And then with those children out of the room, we actually interview the father, and we sort of ask them those very questions. So we've had like a whole bunch of questions, which sort of like, some are about like sort of clearing up bits of their dad's history that they just don't know about, right? So we one of our first ones was we interviewed this really weird cellist, a Polish cellist, a real sort of kind of Central European genius maestro figure, very eccentric, and one of his son's questions was, how did you get out of being recruited by the Polish Secret Service, under Polish state socialism? Okay, so, there are bits and pieces like that. There are also like, but, sometimes it gets, we get into the territory of the family tension, right? So another example would be like, another participant asked us to ask their dad, how close were you and my mum coming to divorce, when I was growing up. And so like, we've just got, I guess.
I think what what has been universal, though, from, obviously not everyone is like listening to episode 1. Yeah, it's like, hey, yeah, maybe my dad was also in the Polish Secret Service. I really should ask him that. Like, there are a lot of very specific questions, specific circumstances, of course. Some funny, some really deep and potentially painful, and others just very specific. Something that is consistent, though, that comes through is that people, particularly adult kids, so often get stuck in this conversational furrow with their dad that they've just never really broken out of since they were a teenager. And so it's just the adult update of, how was school? Good. See you at dinner? Fine. That's just updated to the logistics of them now both being an adult. And so one of the really satisfying things that comes in the podcast, and then particularly even after the recording when we check back in with everyone, is hearing that for the first time in not just a month or this year, but literally decades, they've had a conversation with their father where they were genuinely asking questions and genuinely interested in the answers, as opposed to doing the complete opposite, which so often characterizes adult child, particularly grown child relations.
It is funny, that point where you transition from thinking of your dad as your dad and all the baggage that's associated with that, quite rightly, to thinking of them as a human being. And, we spoke, in fact, we'll encourage our listeners to tune into your episode with us, where we did speak about some of those sort of connections and recognising mortality and all that sort of stuff. But it's kind of weird thinking of your dad as a human. That sounded wrong. But, like distinct from being just his role as your father.
And also understanding that they didn't have it as worked out as we thought they did. They didn't have all the solutions. Doesn't matter what age, you're still kind of muddling it through, and particularly when it comes to parenting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that moment where you sort of like flip out of that that relationship of, father-child, and you start thinking of your dad as a human being, you start thinking of them as a broader entity, it's amazing how that doesn't quite happen for a lot of people as well. Like it's just some people like have to break out of that quite late, and as we keep saying, like when you're in that father-child dynamic, there's a kind of rhythm, and the rhythm is that the father is sort of interested in the child, but not the other way round often. And so like now I think we're at this, especially people our age, we're at this kind of reflective millennial moment where we're like, oh God, I need to see where I've come from, and like, and you actually do want to flip the lens back on your parents. And when you do that, it's amazing the stuff that comes out.
And a lot of it's really practical because, as one of our guests said, she'd never sort of just conceived of her dad as a living entity before she was born, and she's now in her 30s, and that's something that was echoed in various ways by other guests. But again, for her and for so many others, to hear about her dad at her age was so useful because, again, no longer this sort of mysterious, got it all together or distant or even boring parental figure, but simply a human being navigating being in your mid-30s can just be of real practical use. Like, wow, my dad and my mum faced this age before, and they actually might know some things that I'm going through and indeed be able to... I could reflect on their stories if I bothered to ask about them on how to take the next steps in my own life.
I guess, though, with that practical sort of access to knowledge, you also sacrifice some of that magic, and maybe some of the reason why people don't want to burst that bubble is because exactly what Tim said. Your parents are just these, in some cases, hopefully in lots of cases, these wonderful figures that were always there and sort of had it all squared away, and to actually prick that bubble and realise no, they were flawed and they had their issues and all that sort of stuff can be
I'm
killing
thinking more and more about that as we sort of unpack what we've been doing here. And I guess the notion that's coming to me is that question of an inflection point. Like, you don't want to be burdening your kids age 3, hey, little Timmy, I've had a really tough day today, and, the PTSD's acting up again. I'm getting nightmares and I can't get any sleep. You want to protect your children and your family in general from that, particularly when they are in those younger years. So I guess the question is, and maybe this is a question for you guys because it's an inflection point that maybe you guys have hit or are starting to hit or it's in your future. When do you think it would be appropriate to share more of your past with your kids, particularly as they do become adults and your own young adulthood fades into the rear view, and yet maybe would offer them a lot of practical advice by example?
It's a good question. I mean, the R-rated stuff when they reach the age of 18.
As soon as it's 18. Let me tell you how I met your mum.
I think there's also great value, and I'm not avoiding the question, but I'm just going to answer it in a slightly different way. I think that there's also great value that they hear a father's story through the mouths of his friends and colleagues. There's a certain truism in that. We have a very one-dimensional view of what we did and how we did it. So I think that sense of community where, sure, you're there with your son or daughter, but with others telling a little bit of the story. And, there's this principle of, for boys, this wild spirit of a man adventure where fathers, plural, and sons, plural, go away and have these experiences, and that is a platform for those types of conversations. I mean, probably personally, I'm happy to have the conversations with my kids whenever they're ready. They really provide the tripwire for what they want to know and what they want to discuss. And there's a bit of osmosis in the way that you get messages through, and sometimes the time just isn't right for them. They're not that interested. They've got other priorities in their little lives. What do you think, Ben?
I think that there's certain... I actually think the dynamics change, and it changes every generation. And so I don't know that there's direct sort of exact lessons from our childhood that you can just lift and slap into contemporary, teenage years, because the dynamic has changed so much. However, I do think there is that empathy, that constant, or the universal aspect where you're finding your way in the world, you're finding what it means to be an adult. And I think that element of being able to understand that it's tough rather than the literal lessons of this is exactly what you should do. And I mean, for me, I think the internet is massive. It's certainly unprecedented in terms of the influence it's having on kids. And I'm actually really bullish on it for all the sort of fear about social media and what it can do and cyberbullying and all that sort of stuff. The level of sophistication and worldliness and the access to information that my kids have is something I didn't have even at university. And I think it's just amazing. It's frustrating from the classic dad, they fact check me. So my dad knew everything, often wrong, never in doubt. And, he was just this oracle. It's like that Telstra ad, why'd they build the Great Wall and keep the rabbits out? He'd come up with this sort of shit. And we'd just think, he's genius. Whereas my kids are straight on to fact checking me. And,
incredible.
It wasn't the 16th century. It was the 17th century that Botticelli. And it's like, well, fuck you, give me something. So, but this is a positive thing. They know how to gain information, and I think this is, I reckon, a real opportunity for us. And to answer your original question, I think it brings forward that inflection point. I think they are getting exposed to this stuff a lot earlier. That fairy tale of the omniscient sort of got it together dad is probably not as enduring as it used to be.
And hang on, we're supposed to be asking the questions of you two as well.
This is fascinating. Let's keep this dynamic going.
I'm curious, maybe in your own lives with your own fathers, the Dad to Me podcast and you guys doing it does in many ways seem a bit odd, and let's come to that in a little while. But why are you doing this podcast? I mean, what was your motivation to start the Dad to Me podcast?
Yeah, well, probably slightly different motivations, but, I'll speak to my own. For me, it was kind of, it was part of my struggles with my own father, I think, and with my relationship with him. My dad is a textbook kind of quite silent type, but like that's not to say that he's kind of stum about everything and, you know, very gruff or whatever. He's actually got quite a like light, funny, laughy character. But when you kind of press him on some deep questions and on his past, he like really just gives you one word answers. And it was, you know, I just found it impossible to crack him open. So I guess I was thinking about like, you know, some kind of strategy, some kind of medium, some kind of trick to open him up. And that's, you know, that's where the idea was kind of born for me. And Jumped Out of You probably had a slightly different experience, right?
Yeah, well, perhaps a little like you, Ben. My own father passed away a few years ago. And while I always held him up as something of a hero of mine, and there's a lot of crossover in our personality, particularly sort of the performative aspects, he was also a man that had many struggles and many disappointments. And for me, I think that, you know, clouded a lot of that relationship and my own sense of self to the point which, I don't know, I always thought that while there were never any particular burning questions I didn't get to ask my father, I, at the same time, after he passed away, thought it would have been great to just have some more substantive conversations, getting beyond what's in the headline of the current newspapers and getting to the deeper stuff, which was as effusive and performative as he was as a man. It was quite often on the surface, at least within his own family's conversational ambits.
What do you wish you had have asked him, or what do you wish you had have known?
I think for me, and maybe I've touched on this a couple of times just in terms of my questioning of you guys, is that knowing how kind of similar we are and knowing the kind of struggles that I've had, personal and professional, with the kind of vocation that I have as a performer, as a constantly bullshitting loudmouth, to get a sense of what my dad's own sort of struggles and with that were at the same age. And I never got a sense of that necessarily from him. Particularly, he was an older dad compared to most people. He had me at age 45. So his youth was truly a foreign country to me, to my sister, who's even younger than me, and something that I guess I would have just loved to have learnt more about in order to maybe find a little bit of myself a little sooner.
Meanwhile, he's tripping out, so she takes the car. Meanwhile, she's leaving town, but she won't go far.
Yeah, I think just to bring that back to the theme and the question you asked us before, like what have we learned? What has emerged from this? I think one thing I've learned is that older males have a real problem like framing vulnerability. Like they don't sort of, like the way that they tell stories is it never kind of reveals vulnerability or weakness. And I think Jumped Out of You were probably looking for a bit of that from your dad, who was sort of the consummate performer, you know, and whatever vulnerability he did show was a very sort of performative vulnerability, a very kind of, it had a comic effect, you know. You know, this is something that I really want from my dad, like just a kind of reflection on struggle in his life. Like, you know, whenever I ask him about like, I don't know, previous relationships or whatever, he can't sort of give me a very emotional account of it. He can't talk about the ups and downs for him. He can't say, you know, I was in pain then. And that's like, I know that must be there, you know, and I really like, I've tried so many ways to kind of draw that out of him. And yeah, I guess that's partly what we were trying to do with this podcast, to varying degrees of success, because, you know, the boomer the boomer model of masculinity. It's tough work.
Isn't it funny? We've written about vulnerability in our book, The Resilient Shield, and it's a gateway. You show vulnerability, you've opened the door for someone else to show vulnerability to you, and that creates a social connection. It's it's a really interesting thing that we do now, that we know that our fathers and certainly our grandfathers would never have done that. And actually in some walks of life, the rural communities, the farmers, that they want to be that closed up shop. They don't want to demonstrate vulnerability. And I think that the statistics are telling the story on that you bottle it up, you're going to have problems with your mental health, increasing your stress and anxiety and depression. And I think there's a misperception, which is, I'm pleased to say, slipping, that vulnerability equals weakness. I mean, these are two very different concepts. And the work we do in the leadership space is we make a real point of emphasising that by showing vulnerability doesn't necessarily indicate weakness. In most cases, it indicates the opposite. But for us, and maybe it's just our generation, or maybe it's our maleness, or whatever it is, often it feels like that they're the same thing, that by showing vulnerability, we're showing potential chinks in our armour. That's only the case if you're showing them to an enemy. And I think if we're looking at our team or our loved ones, that shouldn't be the case. We had we just have run a leadership retreat. We had 63 on the retreat. A lot of them were under the age of 25, and they're incredibly open. And it doesn't seem that long ago that we were 25, but we weren't using language that they were using. They really are critiquing themselves quite hard, and in many ways quite unfairly. But that said, the community of support around that they get from their peer group is really powerful. And, nearly to Ben's point, I think our concerns at the age of 25 on showing vulnerability would be that it wouldn't resonate with our peer group. You wouldn't get the attention back.
Yeah, that's something we've found as well. I think there's a bit of a generational mismatch between languages, I guess. Where I guess millennials aren't even as sophisticated as this new generation in their early 20s that are emerging. But we have a bit more of a more literacy, I guess, around psychological issues and emotions, and I think that's maybe the stumbling block that I always come up against with my own father. I'm sort of almost pitching him questions that literally don't make sense to him. And so over time, I've with my own dad, I've learned to appreciate other forms of communication between us. For example, my dad is he's very into music, and music kind of strikes this emotional chord within him such that if he hears, I'll be known as Adagio or whatever, a certain classical track, he'll just cry. And that's that's obviously tapping a nerve that language can't really tap. And so, I've tried to get more into that medium with him, and, maybe we can sort of inhabit that space together.
It's fantastic.
Funny you talk about music, and you sort of alluded to that in a previous conversation, but that was a big part for my father and I as well. And as a kid, we'd tinker with cars and do stuff in the shed, this wonderful sort of bonding stuff in hindsight. We'd always have the oldies station on, 4GR, Toowoomba, great classic hits. Nice. And I distinctly remember every time The Cat's in the Cradle, that old Harry Chapin song came on, he'd stop what he's doing and turn it up, and I never twigged, I thought he just liked the song. But it was almost this touch point for him that he was actually being the father, the opposite to the father described in that song. He wanted to spend time with us. And it's only as an adult that I've realised, because I always remember thinking, oh, your dad always used to stop for that song. And now it's oh, shit. Yeah, I get why. Yeah.
What are those lyrics again? Yeah. Amazing. And I think, look, one of the things we definitely, as we got into it, and certainly not our intention, is to at all pathologize these fathers in the way that they go about conducting themselves. If anything, I came away with more respect for that generation, sort of our father's generation, the way that they took just things like creating a family in their stride, just kind of getting on with things that younger generations have who do have so many feelings about and really good at expressing their feelings about it. Yeah. But what about this and what about it? And it's like, every... we mentioned in our the Dad to Me inverse of this episode. I mentioned perhaps sort of slightly out of the blue there, saying, "I think it's a zero-sum game. Life, some things get better, but some things get worse." Yeah, exactly. And I think this process has really kind of affirmed it for me in the sense that yes, our generation of Dr. Tom and I definitely are more comfortable expressing themselves and being welcome to the expression of it, particularly in male circles. At the same time, I look around that same friendship group and, rates of child having and home ownership considerably different to the same age group of our father's generation. And so I guess it depends where your priorities personally and generationally lie. But yeah, it was a contrast that kept coming up, and as somebody who still feels a lot of that sort of fundamental life stages, I'm only just getting onto that ladder. I was really impressed to just hear of these dudes getting on with it.
Yeah. Okay. What Jump Daddy's trying to say is he's become a shock jock who criticizes our generation for too many smashed Avo toasties.
Yeah, I love the getting on with it. It's a wonderful line. Bill Tillman, the famous explorer, someone once asked him, "Oh, Bill, how can I join your expedition? Sounds really exciting. How can I get on the expedition?" And Tillman just replied quite bluntly, "Pull on your boots and just go."
Yeah,
I love that. Okay, so let's talk parenting and rearing a family. You becoming fathers, and 50% of you are. And one of the really beautiful side stories of your podcast is this very factor. So I'll do the easy bit first, Jump Daddy. Children in your life?
Well, I work with them on a pretty much daily basis, which has proven to be a surprisingly powerful prophylactic measure. When your 9 to 5 is built around, entertaining and educating. You can imagine that on the return home, you're looking forward to simply kicking up the feet and forgetting anything child-related. So let's rule a line under that for the moment, because I think there's a more expansive story.
Let's do that. Let's go to Dr. Tom. Your story.
Yeah, well, I do not have a child in my own care, but I have helped to sire a child. I'm a sperm donor to two friends. They're in a same-sex relationship. And a couple of years back, maybe 6-7 years ago, I heard that they were looking for a sperm donor. Looking around a bit, couldn't quite find one that was sort of appropriate. I guess they wanted a known donor in their life. They didn't want an anonymous donation. They wanted this person as part of the whole setup. So I put my hand up. And that was the beginning of a very long process of tests and donations. But it led to a very beautiful little girl called Teddy, who is now 5 years old, and I saw her just the other night.
And do I remember that one of the girls used to be your partner?
No, so that, let me clarify that. Definitely not.
Okay.
No, so basically I met Georgia, one of the mums, the carrier biological mum, through an old mutual friend of ours who was a lover at one point. But you may, I don't know, what story do we reckon this is referring to?
There may be the confusion because a former partner of yours did then later come out as a lesbian.
Yes,
exactly. And your donation was to a lesbian couple.
Exactly. So and it was sort of interesting how those two things dovetailed at the same time in my life. So, I had a 5-year long-term partner who came out as a lesbian, and we broke up pretty much immediately. So I guess I've been directly involved in the lesbian world, for better or worse, in various ways.
It sounds for better. Can you tell me a bit more about the screening process? In my head, I've got this sort of Rocky IV, Drago style. They've hooked you up to machines and made you run on a treadmill, and they're looking at the stats on a clipboard and giving you a battery of psychometric tests. Was it that thorough, or was it
catalogue of perfect sperm donors?
I wish it was that thorough. Yeah, they've obviously, a lot fell through the cracks. No, the testing was basically just blood tests for kind of the more extreme tropical random diseases and HIV, that sort of thing.
So essentially they checked if you had a pulse and could jack off in a cup.
Exactly. Exactly. And that, I passed that test with flying colours.
But, there's also the crucial eyeball test. And it doesn't matter if you are a lesbian. It doesn't matter whatever your persuasion is. If you see Dr. Tom's calves in the wild, that is an indication of strong genetic.
You want that in your bloodline.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like, look.
Yeah, I like to think they're SAS grade calves, if I do say so myself.
We spent a whole week screening for calves on the selection course. So you'd be...
In fact, nearly the opposite for ages. No one ever trained legs. You ran and then you just did bench press. So most SAS blokes have got no calves. Calves like a chicken's instep, as they say. So how was the experience of being a sperm donor? I'm assuming it wasn't very romantic.
No, the money shot moment is definitely not romantic. I mean, you basically just go into this really kind of desiccated, futuristic clinic, and you sit down. You got some reading material, or some videos if you're into that, and then you just go to town. I think you get like about half an hour to. Before the next person has to occupy the hotel room, and then you hope that you can do it within that time, and then you do your business, and then you go out and you hand it into like this kind of these really sort of futuristic staff who are like, again, everything is very clean. Like there's a kind of like. Everyone's wearing gloves, and they have to sort of project this image of like full-on purity, I think, because I guess potential parents are like, we do not want any other contamination, let's say, in this
the cockroach DNA in the mix.
Yeah. So it's definitely very unromantic, but we kind of had fun with it. I think that's advice I would give to any potential donor. It's like. Just like lean into it and
go dressed as a cowboy.
Exactly. I'm actually like talking about donation for another very close friend as we speak. And she actually wants to do the process differently. She doesn't want to go through a kind of official channel. She just wants to like me to sort of come in a cup, and then for her to do the turkey baster method herself immediately afterwards. And so in that case, we're going to, if this happens, we're going to actually make it into a bit of an event. We're going to have a big dinner, we're going to invite all of our friends.
Spectator sport.
Spectator sport, exactly.
Do it before you eat, man. You don't want to be tired.
Your guests want to eat before this happens, I imagine.
Just a couple of tequila shots and you're away.
Yeah, tequila, bad for motility of sperm.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Right. And so just a quick question then before we leave that and come back to the podcast. What role will you have in, your biological child's upbringing?
Yeah, well, we've had sort of 5 years to get used to it now. So we, the kind of definition that we have is more than an uncle, less than a dad. Basically,
truly frightening.
I'm a bit lost in that one.
Exactly.
I'm
It
a
sort
bit
of
weirded
confuses-
out.
Yeah, exactly.
Sounds like something a creepy teacher would tell you.
It's good. It just kills the conversation. People are like, okay, I get it. Yep.
Yeah, right. Okay, moving on.
But what that means in practice for us is that I'm present, so we'll meet up once every 3 months or something. We'll all hang out, but we don't like see each other that much, and like I guess when I'm overseas they send me photos of Ted and give me updates. That's the name of the kid. But yeah, it's pretty chilled out, and I think over time what we've learned is that the kid actually has a lot of say in this, and we've sort of got to respond to what the kid wants. This was something we distinctly forgot to incorporate into our plan, that there would be an extra human with their own subjectivity. So Ted actually fluctuates between interest and kind of complete disengagement from me. And that's just something I'm getting used to, that these things go in waves. And, I think ultimately by the time she's a teenager or maybe older, hopefully there'll be like more interest and we'll have a close relationship. But until that point, I'm just kind of responding to what she wants.
And she knows, obviously, as much as a 5-year-old sort of is
as
tracking on this stuff.
As much as a 5-year-old does. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, she understands that I'm a donor and I'm somehow important in, creating her, but anything more than that, she's, I don't think she'd be able to explain it yet. So yeah, I think that's maybe part of, like, she does understand it at some deep level, and that's maybe part of the push and pull between sort of interest and disengagement. Like sometimes I'm like a bit of an exotic figure for her and she's kind of really into it. Other times it's maybe it's a bit too much pressure for her, like she doesn't like the idea that there's this like guy that she barely knows outside her family ambit.
The sun began to shine on all the molecules that made the people matter.
So coming back to the podcast, what's next for the Dad to Me podcast? Anyone that you'd love to have on the show?
So, and I'm not making a word of this up. I picked up a particular CD from Salvo's over the Christmas break. It was Kamal Sings Christmas.
Yeah.
And I was pumping it in my car, much to the annoyance of my partner and Dr. Tom, and the times he was unfortunate enough to drive to the studio with me. But I was loving it. And I was joking out loud, it'd be amazing to get Kamal, who is a father and who has some pretty interesting kids of his own, some of who sort of tried to pursue the Australian pop star career and never quite made it to their heights of their dad. 2 weeks ago, I was walking through Chatswood Chase. Oh, baby. Who is that figure coming my way in entertaining a young lady on his arm? Nice one. I passed him, double take, and I raced back. We have an email, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm going to be pitching one of our dream guests. Watch this space for the king of easy listening. So that's a fantasy that may or may not be coming true. Something that's definitely coming true is that Dr. Tom is heading off to Italy very shortly to continue his Latin studies, which never end. But we are also then making the most of that. Dad to Me Season 2 is called working title Dad to Me Diaspora. And we're going to be looking at the father-child relationships across continents between Australia and Italy, and within particularly the Italo-Australian community, of which there are so many fascinating names, fascinating stories. And I think this story really needs an update. The last big sort of story in that sphere, in pop culture at least, was probably like Looking for Alibrandi, which was a very big and popular movie 20 years ago. Yeah. And so we've got a couple of really exciting names joining us to kind of co-host the pod, one alongside me here in Australia and one alongside Dr. Tom in Italy. So we're taking what we think works in the format and adding a bit of a Latin twist. And I mean Latin in the like the loosest, like not Ricky, not the Ricky Martin is not going to be joining
Romance.
Well, I wish you all the best for season 2. How do people find out more about you and the Dad to Me podcast?
Yeah, well, we are available through all the major platforms. If you check out Dad to Me, DADTOME, and on social media at Instagram at dad2.me, DADTO.me.
Someone already had the Dad to Me at Instagram.
Yeah, and it's one of those really annoying ones where they've got it and they haven't posted anything. Like they signed up for Instagram like 10 years ago. Thought,
Yeah.
this
Like
is a hilarious
typo
one
of dead to me or something.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Huh.
Guys, thanks very much for being on the Unforgiving 60 podcast. Been a lot of fun having you on, and hopefully when we're next in the same orbit, we can talk Latin, comedy, philosophy. And happy to come to Italy if you're paying too, Dr. Tom.
Yeah, do you know how much I get paid in the UK as an academic? Anyway, thank you so much, guys. Tim, Ben, this was really fun.
Or see you guys.
See ya.
Cheers.
All you businessmen, politicians, gather round and meet my friends. Folk come here tonight to listen in to you justify your sins. Well, you smoke too much, you drink too much, you're blind. Oh, once you understand that your truth is in denial. Oh, once a year you come around and everybody thinks that you're so cool. But nothing like reality to cool the fool in you. The party has gone too far this time. No one has you full cost of never see the crime. Where do we run to? Where do we go? Why don't you just wait here at the bar while I go outside and go around the corner and get our car? We'll leave this old town behind, buy some beer, drive down south till dawn. Or we can cruise down along the coast, maybe park down by the swell. Tune into the big US radio, 18 million. Party has gone too far this time. Yeah, it's been a while since it's been away this long. Where can we run to? Where can she stay? Polly's drunk again. She lifts up her summer tree, yes. She don't mind so much as long as she can see his face. Who can remember a time when all this seemed so unreal? Only the memory remains. Party has gone too far this time. No one has to call a cop for them to see the crime. Where do we run to? Where do we go?
Now to the debrief. We relentlessly pursue excellence on Unforgiving 60, and we want your insights and feedback. And indeed, if you know someone who has great insights to share with us that have a practical difference, then get in touch with us at debrief@unforgiving60.com. That's unforgiving60.com. We love speaking to anyone who's been walking on the path less travelled and is generally living the life less ordinary. And if you like the podcast, please rate us on iTunes. You can also follow us on social media. Just search at Unforgiving60, that's Unforgiving60. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. You know what to do. See you next episode on the Unforgiving 60.
All you businessmen, politicians, gather around and meet my friends. Folk come here tonight.